if they had been able to introduce Denny's, would there have been? Do I believe there's a reasonable suspicion that there may have been a different outcome in the trial?
No, do you think that they Dean and Jerry would have created a different narrative to the defense? Because basically, Ken's always whinging that, basically that stop pointing at these officers, these poor officers, they've got families, but that's the only direction that the defense had, was to point at these officers because Denny was taken off the table for them. So my question is, as a defense narrative, do we think it would have been a different trial if they were allowed to introduce Denny? So instead of pointing all the fingers at law enforcement saying frame, 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 if they were allowed to say, for example, Bobby Dassey, would they have maybe eased off on the defense of being all law enforcement? You actually hear Dean and Jerry say in, I think it was the first or second episode, no defense lawyer wants to go in and accuse law enforcement of being a part of a frame up or a crime per se. So again, if it's more on the basis of the defense narrative of how they sold Stephen's innocence in terms of who else could have been responsible and what direction the courts would have probably understood a little bit more. Because again, we see the outcome. The Ken ended up using it to his advantage yet again. He said at the end of it, if you want to believe law enforcement had anything to do with it, you then have to be convinced that they killed her as well. So if we didn't have that part of this story, if there was a Denny that was a part of it, do we think it would have been different?
Yeah. So now that I understand your question better, I think it would have had to have been different almost by definition, because they would have had to taken the time to introduce this person as a Denny suspect, potentially question that person on the stand, and then summarize in the closing arguments, and anything that they felt came out of the testimony of the Denny, including, well, this person had means, motive, and whatever the Denny prongs were. The third Denny prong is proximity. So I think it would have been, by definition, almost different than it would have. I don't think they would have laid off the key, and I don't think they would have laid off item FL, because those are just two gemstones. But they would have had to definitely formed a different narrative. They would have had to have, at least had a narrative about where the line is that Dr. Silkman just talked about, of where did the murder end and the planting begin. They would have had to have said something about that narrative. That might have made it sound less convincing, so they might have tried to blur that line as much as possible.
I think I agree. I think the dynamics of the case would have been very, very different, right? If they were able to present a very strong argument for Denny's, like Ryan Hilligus being an ex-boyfriend and his involvement, the way he involved himself in the search, and the fact, all the things that we've discussed about, Ryan Hilligus potentially could have been in trouble. But the number one person who I believe would have really been in trouble, and that's Bobby Dassey, right? Rightly or wrongly, he would have made a very, very strong Denny suspect. You could have packaged him quite easily as being a potential co-conspirator or murderer, but they couldn't do that. The only third party that they could mention was Brendan Dassey himself, right? So in other words, the defense teams themselves, they were handcuffed. They weren't allowed to go to any other third party unless they mentioned Brendan Dassey, right? So I do believe that the dynamics and maybe even the outcome of the trial would have been very different had they been able to point to third parties.
I think I'll take a swing at that one, and my answer is probably going to be more of a question, and that's, would it be easier to sell a jury on one of these other Denny suspects, any of the names that you've already raised, or law enforcement? And I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, it's going to be easier for a jury to accept one of these other Denny suspects than it is to accept the law enforcement angle. And I think that that's maybe the crux of the point that we're trying to get to here, is that by limiting their ability to name other people, they've put a target on the backs of MTSO, because you're not allowing me to actually go and name someone who we actually think did it. You're limiting me to that. You're only allowing me A, Brendan Dassey, or B, pointing the finger at law enforcement. And so to act like they're so surprised that you're pointing the finger at law enforcement, it's kind of ridiculous, because they were forced to have that choice.
That's exactly my point, Jeff Jones. That's how I was going to sum it up, because I knew we were all going to go with this, the same thing. I was going to say, so I don't know why they're acting so shocked. They knew this was a false narrative that the defense were going to have to come up with. They knew it. They would have had to have seen it. They knew that they couldn't bring up Denny. They were going to have to focus on someone did it. They had no choice.